In the spring of 1945, as Allied armies closed on Berlin from east and west, something extraordinary was happening across occupied Europe. Not extraordinary in its wonder, but in its horror, and in what it would reveal about human systems, about how vast organizations function, and about the uncomfortable truth that atrocity operates not through monsters alone, but through the mundane cooperation of ordinary people performing ordinary tasks. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. The Third Reich had built something unprecedented in human history, an industrial system. Approximately 1 million people, imagine that number for a moment, 1 million individuals across occupied Europe, all connected in a vast network dedicated to a single terrible purpose. This wasn't an army alone, though armies were part of it. This wasn't merely a government, though government machinery drove it. This was an entire ecosystem of persecution, deportation, and mass murder, functioning with the efficiency of any modern industrial enterprise. Consider the scale. More than 40,000 detention facilities spread from France to Ukraine. Not merely the infamous names we remember: Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, but thousands upon thousands of smaller camps, transit centers, labor facilities, each requiring staff, administration, supply chains. At Auschwitz alone, approximately 7,000 SS members served between 1940 and 1945. 7,000 people, just at one complex. And beyond them, thousands more in civilian administrative roles: accountants, clerks, technicians. Picture this machinery in motion. Railway bureaucrats coordinating trains carrying millions to their deaths, scheduling these transports between routine cargo shipments with the same precision they applied to commercial freight. In Warsaw, in Łódź, in hundreds of other cities, administrators managing sealed ghetto districts where Jewish populations slowly starved, tracking resources, maintaining boundaries, processing paperwork. The Einsatzgruppen, those mobile killing squads that followed Wehrmacht advances into Eastern Europe, employed thousands of shooters who executed entire villages, kept meticulous records, filed reports, and everywhere, doctors, selecting arrivals at death camps for immediate killing or temporary labor, making life and death decisions with the casual efficiency of sorting packages on an assembly line. Lawyers drafting the Nuremberg laws and hundreds of subsequent decrees, each one methodically stripping Jews of citizenship, property, rights, transforming persecution into legal procedure. Police officers in Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin, conducting roundups with the routine professionalism they brought to any law enforcement task. This is what makes the system so remarkable, in the most terrible sense. These weren't all zealous believers. They weren't all sadistic volunteers. Many simply took jobs, positions with regular salaries, housing, career advancement. The machine ran on ordinary bureaucrats processing paperwork, train engineers following schedules, accountants tracking stolen property, guards punching time cards. Genocide, it turns out, becomes routine work. Now, imagine you are one of these million people as defeat approaches in 1945, Soviet forces advancing from the east, discovering the death camps, promising vengeance. Allied armies closing from the west, their leaders declaring intentions to prosecute war crimes, concentration camp prisoners, liberated with rage burning in their hearts, sometimes killing guards on sight. You understand some of them understood, at least that reckoning approaches. But here emerges a strange mathematical reality, one that would shape everything that followed. How does one prosecute 1 million people? How could any court system, even working for decades, process that many cases? The very scale that made the Holocaust possible would, paradoxically, provide protection to many who participated in it. This wasn't planned. It was simply a consequence of numbers, of overwhelming, incomprehensible numbers. Yet, while this protective anonymity existed in theory, the Nazi leadership had already begun preparing. Long before final defeat seemed certain, key figures started creating contingencies. Watch how systems adapt when faced with extinction. SS officers transferring funds to Swiss accounts, officials creating false documents, establishing alternate identities with fabricated histories, resources moving to safe locations outside Germany, contact established with sympathetic parties abroad, communication channels designed to survive the regime's collapse, gold from dental fillings, the gold torn from mouths of murdered Jews, stolen jewelry, art looted from occupied territories across Europe, all of it converted to portable wealth, currency that could fund escapes, buy passage, purchase new identities. The machinery of theft, which had operated throughout the war, now served a new purpose, not enriching the Reich, but financing individual survival. In Austria, monasteries received quiet visits from SS officers, shedding their uniforms for civilian clothes. Catholic clergy, particularly those harbouring anti-communist sympathies, began discussions about helping these refugees reach safety. In Rome, Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima, openly sympathized with fascism. He believed former Nazis would prove essential in the coming struggle against Soviet expansion. A Croatian priest, Father Krunoslav Draganović, established offices that would become central nodes in escape networks spanning continents. The Vatican's Refugee Commission, created for genuinely humanitarian purposes to help the millions displaced by war, would soon issue thousands of travel documents based on minimal verification. Papers that ask no questions about a person's recent past, about what they might have done between 1939 and 1945. Consider how infrastructure forms in times of chaos. Safe houses appearing along routes from Germany through Austria into Italy. Sympathetic officials in displaced persons camps, overwhelmed facilities, housing millions of genuine refugees, learning to look the other way when suspicious characters arrived without proper documentation. The International Red Cross, facing an impossible task, attempting to process millions of displaced persons with limited resources, issuing travel documents that required only 2 witnesses to confirm identity. 2 witnesses. Think about that requirement. In a world where millions knew each other from camps, from SS units, from administrative offices, former colleagues could easily serve as witnesses for each other. A chain of false identities, each link supported by mutual deception. The Red Cross operated with humanitarian intentions, certainly, but insufficient resources for verification meant their documents became, inadvertently, the most important tool enabling fugitive escapes. This combination, deliberate planning by Nazi leadership, sympathetic assistance from certain clergy and officials, bureaucratic chaos created by millions of genuine refugees created pathways, corridors through which thousands would vanish. The same organizational efficiency that characterized Nazi Germany's war machine now served individual survival. The architecture of genocide had employed 1 million people. The architecture of escape would save thousands from justice. And here we must pause and consider something profound about human systems, about how organizations function, how infrastructure develops, how networks form even in collapse. The Nazi state had created an unprecedented apparatus of death, but in doing so, it had also created something else: expertise in organization, in logistics, in documentation, in moving people and resources across borders. These capabilities, developed for terrible purposes, now served escape. Systems, once built, don't simply disappear when their original purpose ends. They transform, they adapt. The railways that carried millions to death camps still ran, now carrying survivors home, but also, sometimes, carrying perpetrators to safety. The documents that once identified Jews for deportation now, in forged or false versions, provided new identities for those fleeing prosecution. The financial networks that transferred stolen wealth during the war now moved funds to Swiss accounts, to South American banks, anywhere beyond Allied reach. Life, we often say, finds a way, but so too does human organization. Networks persist, connections endure, and in the chaos of Europe in 1945, millions displaced, borders uncertain, authorities overwhelmed those who understood how systems worked, who possessed resources, who maintained connections, could navigate pathways invisible to those without such knowledge. The million-strong machine was shutting down, but its components, the individual people, the organizational knowledge, the networks of mutual assistance were transforming into something new, a diaspora of perpetrators, each carrying within them the memory of genocide, each seeking sanctuary, each hoping that distance and time might grant what justice would not. Forgiveness. The spring of 1945 marked not merely an ending, but a beginning, the beginning of one of history's greatest failures of justice. Not because evil proved too powerful to defeat the Allied armies had accomplished that. Not because evidence was lacking the death camps stood as testament. Not because the will for justice was absent, survivors demanded accountability, Allied leaders proclaimed it. The failure would come from something more fundamental. From the sheer scale of the crime itself, which had required so many participants that comprehensive prosecution became mathematically impossible. From the immediate shift in geopolitical priorities as the Cold War emerged, making former enemies suddenly useful. From the sympathies of certain institutions, which valued ideology above justice. From bureaucratic chaos that provided cover for escape. And from time itself, which would gradually erode evidence, memory, and eventually the possibility of full accountability. 1 million people had participated in genocide. How many would face justice? As we shall discover, only a tiny fraction. The rest would vanish into the world, carrying their secrets with them. Some living openly under their real names, protected by governments that valued their skills. Others adopting new identities, building new lives, maintaining silence about their pasts. Still others perpetually mobile, moving between countries, always one step ahead of those who hunted them. The architecture of genocide had employed 1 million. The architecture of escape would save thousands. And the questions created by this vast failure of justice, questions about accountability, about institutional complicity, about how perpetrators evade consequences, would echo across 8 decades, remaining unanswered even into our present day. This is the story of the greatest manhunt in history, and of the greatest escape. The rat lines ran like veins through post-war Europe, pulsing with fugitives desperate to reach safety. And when I say rat lines, I mean something quite specific, not random escape routes, but carefully organized networks, established procedures, known contacts, reliable safe houses, systems, in other words, functioning with the same organizational efficiency that had characterized Nazi Germany itself. The primary paths led from Germany through Austria, over the Alps into Italy, and eventually to Mediterranean ports where ships departed for South America. Other routes existed through Spain, through the Middle East, even through Scandinavia. But the Italian route became the highway for the most significant escapes. Perhaps 5,000 former SS members, concentration camp personnel, and Nazi officials moved along these pathways between 1945 and 1950. 5,000 individuals who should have faced justice, vanishing instead into new lives across the ocean. Let me tell you about one journey in particular, because it exemplifies how these escapes functioned. Adolf Eichmann, Obersturmbannführer, the man responsible for implementing the final solution, coordinating deportation trains across Europe, managing the logistics of mass murder, among the most wanted men in Europe, certainly. Yet observe what happened. In May 1945, American forces captured him. But he gave a false name, Otto Eckmann. The Americans, processing thousands upon thousands of prisoners in those chaotic final weeks, didn't identify him. Within months, he escaped custody, simply walked away, and went underground, moving through Bavaria with assistance from former SS networks still functioning despite the Reich's collapse. He worked as a lumberjack, using the name Otto Henniger, later as a chicken farmer. For 4 years, 4 full years, he remained in Germany. Hiding, yes, but hiding in plain sight. Gathering resources. Waiting, watching as international attention shifted from Nazi hunting to Cold War confrontation. And when the moment seemed right, in 1950, he began moving south. The journey took him through Austria, where he connected with contacts who provided documents. then into Italy. In Rome, he received assistance from Father Draganovic's organization at Via Tomacelli. The Pontifical Commission for Assistance, a Vatican institution, issued him a travel document. Under what name? Riccardo Clement, identified as a humanitarian refugee. Think about that designation, humanitarian refugee, applied to the architect of genocide. The Red Cross, relying on this Vatican document, and 2 witness statements from people who confirmed his identity. Likely fellow fugitives issued a travel passport. With these papers, Riccardo Clement booked passage on a ship called the Giovanna C departing Genoa. Destination: Buenos Aires. July 1950. The architect of genocide travelled under an alias created by church officials, carrying documents from international humanitarian organizations, sailing toward Argentina on a ship full of legitimate immigrants seeking new lives. The cost? Approximately $1,500, paid in cash, money that almost certainly came from looted Jewish property, converted years earlier to portable currency, hidden and preserved for exactly this purpose. One man's journey, but multiply this across thousands of similar escapes, each following comparable patterns, and you begin to understand the scale of what occurred. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who conducted sadistic medical experiments on prisoners, followed a similar path, though with an interesting variation. After the war, he initially used his real name, working as a farmhand in Bavaria. The Allies, it turned out, hadn't prioritized him on wanted lists. He wasn't considered sufficiently important. Not yet. By 1949, sensing danger as prosecutors expanded their scope, he fled to Italy. Using the name Helmut Gregor Nau, he obtained Vatican and Red Cross documents and sailed for Argentina, arriving in Buenos Aires that same year. But unlike Eichmann, who would eventually be captured, Mengele understood something crucial about survival: mobility, perpetual motion. When Argentina became uncomfortable in the 1950s, he moved to Paraguay. There, dictator Alfredo Stroessner granted him citizenship under his real name Josef Mengele in 1959. Granted citizenship, mind you, to a man internationally wanted for war crimes. When pressure mounted in Paraguay, he fled to Brazil, changing identities again. Wolfgang Gerhard. For 34 years after the war, he lived in South America, moving between countries, changing names like shedding skins, protected by distance, by sympathetic authorities, by German expatriate communities that harbored him despite knowing, or perhaps because they knew exactly who he was. Now consider a different kind of protector: Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon who tortured French resistance fighters and deported thousands of Jews, who personally sent 44 Jewish children from an orphanage in Isieux to their deaths. France wanted him desperately. But between 1947 and 1951, U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps employed Barbie in Germany. Employed him, paid him approximately $1,700. Monthly, roughly $25,000 in today's currency for intelligence on communist networks. American intelligence agencies valued his knowledge of communist activities above his crimes against humanity, above torture, above mass murder. When France demanded extradition in 1951, CIC agents didn't arrest Barbie and hand him over to Allied authorities. Instead, they organized his escape, provided false documents identifying him as Klaus Altmann, moved him through the rat lines, arranged passage to Bolivia, where he arrived under American protection. Barbie lived openly in Bolivia for 32 years, working as a businessman, even advising the Bolivian military on interrogation techniques, teaching others the methods he'd perfected in Lyon. His escape wasn't despite American knowledge, but because of American assistance. A direct operation by U.S. intelligence agents who prioritized Cold War utility over justice. The ships departing from Genoa, Naples, and other Mediterranean ports carried hundreds of former Nazis among legitimate refugees. The Giovanna C, which transported Eichmann, made regular runs between Italy and Argentina. Croatian steamer services, sympathetic to fascist refugees, offered passage without excessive questioning. That cost I mentioned, $1,500 per person, represented substantial money in post-war Europe, equivalent to roughly $22,000 today. Yet many fugitives possessed such resources. How? Because SS officers had systematically looted Jewish property throughout the war, converting valuables to gold, to diamonds, to hard currency. Some buried these stashes before fleeing Germany. Others transferred funds to Swiss banks using numbered accounts. And Odessa networks, those mutual aid societies of former SS members, provided financial assistance to members in need, supporting each other's escapes the way legitimate fraternal organizations support their members in times of hardship. Argentina became the primary destination, and for specific reasons. President Juan Perón actively sought European immigration to modernize his nation. German technical expertise particularly interested him. His government issued approximately 5,000 visas to Germans between 1946 and 1950, with minimal investigation of applicants' backgrounds. Argentina also had large German communities, especially in Buenos Aires and Bariloche. Expatriates maintaining German language, customs, mutual assistance networks. The country had no extradition treaty with many European nations. And most importantly, Perón's government adopted a deliberate policy of non-cooperation with Nazi hunting efforts. They viewed former Nazis as potential assets rather than war criminals. Some estimates suggest approximately 5,000 former SS members settled in Argentina during the late 1940s and early 1950s. 5,000. In one country alone. Other destinations offered similar sanctuary. Paraguay under Stroessner welcomed fugitives, providing citizenship and protection. Brazil absorbed thousands into German immigrant communities in São Paulo and southern regions. Syria and Egypt employed former Wehrmacht and SS officers as military advisors, valuing their combat experience against the new state of Israel. Even Canada and the United States, despite stated policies against admitting war criminals, failed to screen thousands of immigrants effectively. Eastern European collaborators who'd served in police units or auxiliary forces simply omitted these details from visa applications, and overwhelmed immigration officials, processing massive numbers of refugees, didn't pursue thorough verification. The International Red Cross issued approximately 120,000 travel documents between 1945 and 1950, genuinely intended, for legitimate refugees who'd lost papers during wartime chaos. The process required only a photograph, a statement of identity, and 2 witnesses confirming the applicant's name. No additional verification, no background checks, no investigation of wartime activities. Former SS members served as witnesses for each other, creating chains of false identities supported by mutual deception. The Red Cross, operating with humanitarian intentions but insufficient resources for verification, inadvertently became the most important institution, enabling fugitive escapes. And this raises something worth contemplating about unintended consequences, about how systems designed for good can be exploited for evil. The Vatican's refugee program, genuinely established to help millions displaced by war, issuing documents that asked no questions about recent pasts. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by the humanitarian crisis, unable to verify identities thoroughly. Even the chaos itself, millions of genuine refugees, creating conditions where a few thousand war criminals could hide among them. Nature shows us that camouflage works best in complexity. A single insect on a bare surface is easily spotted. That same insect in dense foliage becomes invisible. The post-war refugee crisis created exactly such density. Millions of displaced persons, all seeking new lives, all requiring documentation, all moving across borders. Perfect cover for those with something to hide. The rat lines carried thousands across the mountains and over the sea, transforming war criminals into refugees, murderers into immigrants, perpetrators of genocide into ordinary citizens of distant nations. The journey from Berlin to Buenos Aires took months of careful movement, strategic identity changes, and significant resources. But for thousands, it succeeded. They vanished into new lives while their victims' families still searched for answers. While survivors testified at Nuremberg, while prosecutors attempted to document the full scale of Nazi crimes, while the world slowly comprehended what had occurred in the camps, the perpetrators were already gone, sailing south under false names, starting businesses in Buenos Aires, farming in Paraguay, teaching at military academies in Cairo, living in German communities that asked no questions because they didn't want answers. And the most remarkable aspect? Many lived openly, not hiding in remote jungles or isolated mountain villages, but in cities, attending churches, joining social clubs, sending their children to schools, building ordinary lives in plain sight, protected not by secrecy but by distance, by sympathetic governments, by the simple fact that no one was looking very hard. Not yet, but some would never stop looking. Some would hunt these fugitives for decades, driven by memory, by moral imperative, by the conviction that certain crimes transcend time and borders. That justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. The great vanishing had succeeded. But the great hunt was only beginning. Now, we come to the greatest scandal of all. Not that Nazi war criminals escaped, that much we've established, but that powerful governments actively protected them. While prosecutors in Nuremberg conducted trials, while survivors demanded justice, intelligence agencies in Washington, London, and Moscow were recruiting former Nazis for the emerging Cold War. The calculation proved brutally simple. Yesterday's enemy possessed knowledge and skills valuable against today's adversary. Anti-communist intelligence outweighed crimes against humanity. Utility trumped morality. Let me tell you about Operation Paperclip. The American program to recruit German scientists brought approximately 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States between 1945 and 1959. Initially, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency screened candidates, excluding ardent Nazis and war criminals. Standards existed, lines that wouldn't be crossed. But watch what happens when competition intensifies. As Cold War tensions accelerated, as Soviet acquisition of German scientists proceeded, those standards relaxed, then relaxed further, until they disappeared almost entirely. Security officials began sanitizing files, removing evidence of Nazi Party membership, erasing SS affiliations, deleting references to slave labor use. The program's crown jewel was Wernher von Braun, an SS officer who developed V-2 rockets using slave labor from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. At that camp, approximately 20,000 prisoners worked. 9,000 died from executions, starvation, brutal conditions. 9,000 human beings died building weapons under von Braun's direction. Yet von Braun arrived in America, received security clearance, eventually led NASA's rocket program, became celebrated as the father of American space exploration. His team included dozens with similar histories, all quietly absorbed into defense and aerospace programs, all presented to the American public as brilliant scientists who happened to be German, with their actual pasts carefully obscured. The justification centered on Soviet competition. The Red Army had captured German rocket facilities at Peenemünde, brought hundreds of scientists to Moscow. If America didn't recruit German expertise, the reasoning went, the Soviets would monopolize advanced weapons technology. National security demanded compromising on individual backgrounds, but this reasoning expanded far beyond scientists. The CIA's Operation Bloodstone, beginning in 1948, recruited Eastern European refugees, former Wehrmacht intelligence officers, Ukrainian police collaborators, Baltic SS veterans, all recruited for anti-Soviet operations. Their knowledge of Soviet territory, languages, Communist Party structures, this was valued. That many had participated in mass shootings of Jews during the war seemed, to intelligence officials, a regrettable but irrelevant detail. Consider how remarkable this moral calculus becomes. These weren't merely overlooking minor infractions. These were men who had participated in genocide, who had shot civilians into mass graves. who had rounded up Jewish families for deportation, and intelligence agencies representing democratic nations that had just fought a war against Nazi ideology were putting these men on payroll. Klaus Barbie's case exemplifies how far this logic extended. The butcher of Lyon had tortured French resistance fighters, personally beaten prisoners to death, organized deportations, sending thousands of Jews to Auschwitz. France wanted him tried for crimes against humanity. France, an allied nation, a democratic partner, requesting extradition of a man who had terrorized their citizens. Yet between 1947 and 1951, U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps kept him employed, paying approximately $1,700 monthly for intelligence on communist FAR activities in Germany. When French authorities intensified demands for extradition in 1951, CIC didn't arrest Barbie. They smuggled him out of Europe. Officers provided false identity papers, moved him through the rat lines, arranged passage to Bolivia, sent him away with escape funds. American intelligence agents didn't merely fail to prosecute a war criminal, they actively obstructed justice from an allied nation. Then organized his escape, funded his flight, even fabricated reports claiming Barbie had died, deliberately misleading French investigators. British intelligence engaged similar recruitment in occupied Germany. Former Gestapo and SD officers, valued for their files on Soviet intelligence, found employment with British military government. Reinhard Gehlen Wehrmacht, Major General who ran military intelligence on the Eastern Front, surrendered to Americans in May 1945, carrying microfilmed records of Soviet military capabilities. The U.S. Army intelligence established the Gehlen Organization, funded it with millions of dollars, allowed Gehlen to employ hundreds of former Wehrmacht and SS intelligence officers. In 1956, when West Germany gained sovereignty, this organization became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Federal Intelligence Service. With Gehlen as its first president, former Nazis staffed the intelligence service of democratic West Germany, their backgrounds overlooked because their expertise served anti-communist purposes. The fox, as it were, guarding the henhouse, or perhaps more accurately, the wolf, reformed in name only, now employed to guard against other wolves. The Soviet Union, despite proclaiming moral superiority over the capitalist West's Nazi recruitment, pursued identical policies. The NKVD and later KGB employed former Wehrmacht officers who switched sides, used them for intelligence on Western military capabilities. German rocket scientists, captured in the East, worked on Soviet missile programs. The difference wasn't in principle, but only in propaganda. Western recruitment became public knowledge. Soviet programs remained classified. Argentina under Juan Perón pursued perhaps the most blatant protection policy. Between 1946 and 1955, Perón's government issued approximately 5,000 visas to Germans with minimal background checks, actively recruiting technical expertise for industrialization programs. Former Luftwaffe pilots found employment with the Argentine Air Force. Wehrmacht officers advised the military. Engineers worked in manufacturing. The government didn't merely tolerate their presence, they celebrated Germanic contribution to national development. When Simon Wiesenthal provided Argentine authorities with information about Eichmann's presence in Buenos Aires in 1952, the government didn't investigate. They tipped off the German community, warning Eichmann, forcing him into temporary hiding. Argentina valued European immigration more than Allied requests for cooperation in prosecuting war criminals. Paraguay, under Alfredo Stroessner, ruling from 1954 to 1989, granted citizenship to hundreds of former Nazis, including Josef Mengele, who received Paraguayan citizenship under his real name in 1959. Despite being internationally wanted for war crimes, Stroessner, educated by German Jesuits and sympathetic to Germanic culture, saw no problem harboring fugitives. Eduard Roschmann, the butcher of Riga, responsible for deporting and murdering thousands of Latvian Jews, lived openly in Paraguay until his death in 1977. Germany issued arrest warrants, requested extradition. Paraguay ignored every request. Syria and Egypt hired former Wehrmacht and SS officers as military advisors in the 1950s, valuing their combat experience against the newly formed State of Israel. Alois. Brunner responsible for deportation of Jews from Austria, Greece and France. Over 128,000 people sent to death camps fled to Syria in 1954. He lived in Damascus for 5 decades. 5 decades. Protected by successive Syrian governments that employed him as advisor on security and interrogation. Germany issued arrest warrants repeatedly, requested extradition repeatedly. Syria never complied. Brunner died in Damascus around 2010, having lived 66 years after the war without facing trial. Even West Germany itself proved a sanctuary for thousands of lower-level perpetrators. The post-war German judicial system included many former Nazi judges and prosecutors, men who'd sentenced resistance fighters to death, presided over racial courts, drafted legal frameworks for persecution, now sitting in judgment of the new democracy. They showed remarkable reluctance to prosecute former colleagues. Of approximately 8,000 prosecutions initiated in West Germany between 1945 and 2010, the vast majority targeted low-level guards, not decision-makers. Judges and lawyers who'd drafted the Nuremberg laws largely escaped prosecution. Doctors who'd conducted forced sterilizations returned to medical practice. Police officers who'd conducted deportations kept their jobs. The Cold War provided perfect cover for this institutional protection. Any thorough prosecution of Nazi crimes would have exposed thousands of officials in government, judiciary, intelligence services, destabilizing West Germany at the precise moment when it served as bulwark against Soviet expansion. Better, the reasoning went, to quietly let the past remain past. Focus on building democratic institutions, opposing communism. The Federal Republic needed stability and legitimacy more than comprehensive justice. This calculation shaped German policy for decades. Limited prosecutions that demonstrated acknowledgement of responsibility while avoiding systematic pursuit of all perpetrators. And here we must pause and consider what this teaches us about institutions, about how organizations prioritize, about how present needs can overwhelm historical obligations. These weren't evil institutions, necessarily. They were institutions facing complex pressures, making calculations about competing priorities. But in making those calculations, they chose utility over justice, chose stability over accountability, chose pragmatism over morality. The pattern repeated globally. Intelligence agencies classified files that could expose protected individuals. Governments refused extradition requests from allies. Military services employed men with bloody pasts because they possessed valuable skills. The architecture of protection stretched from Washington to Buenos Aires, from London to Cairo, creating a global system that shielded thousands of war criminals from accountability. The rat lines moved fugitives out of Europe, but government policies kept them safe once they arrived, protected them, employed them, granted them citizenship, allowed them to build new lives while their victims' families still mourned. And the most troubling aspect? This wasn't conspiracy, wasn't secret cabal. These were official government programs, documented policies, decisions made by intelligence agencies, approved by officials, implemented through proper channels. Evil, it turned out, didn't require darkness. It could function perfectly well in daylight, justified by bureaucratic reasoning and national security concerns. The hunters we'll meet next faced not merely individual fugitives, but entire systems designed to protect them. They faced governments that actively obstructed investigations, intelligence agencies that classified crucial evidence, courts staffed by former Nazis reluctant to prosecute colleagues. A global network of protection that made comprehensive justice not merely difficult but effectively impossible. Yet some refused to accept impossibility. Some believed that certain crimes transcended politics, transcended national interests, transcended the passage of time. They would hunt anyway, for decades, for lifetimes, against all odds and all obstacles. Against this vast system of protection and indifference, A handful of individuals refused to accept that genocide would go unpunished. And I want you to consider the remarkable audacity of this refusal, facing governments that harbored war criminals, intelligence agencies that employed them, legal systems reluctant to prosecute them, and deciding nonetheless to hunt. Simon Wiesenthal stands at the beginning of this story, a survivor of 5 concentration camps who lost 89 family members in the Holocaust. In 1947, he established a small office in Vienna dedicated to documenting Nazi crimes and locating perpetrators. Small doesn't adequately describe it. Modest, a few rooms on. Rudolfsplatz. Working with minimal funding, often covering expenses from his own pocket and no official authority whatsoever. For decades, Wiesenthal tracked leads, interviewed witnesses, examined documents, pressured governments to act. From that modest headquarters, he compiled evidence on over 1,100 Nazi war criminals, providing documentation that led to prosecutions across Europe and South America. His method combined detective work with moral persistence. He collected testimony from survivors, noting details about perpetrators, physical descriptions, names, locations, specific crimes. He examined displaced persons' records, immigration documents, telephone directories in cities where fugitives might have fled. When he received tips about suspicious Germans living in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo, he investigated through correspondence and local contacts, maintained extensive files, cross-referenced information, built cases that could withstand judicial scrutiny. But Wiesenthal understood something crucial. Documentation alone accomplished nothing. He pressured prosecutors to act, wrote to politicians, contacted journalists, publicly shamed governments that harbored war criminals. His persistence continuing for 5 decades, until his death in 2005, kept pressure on authorities who would have preferred to forget. In 1953, he received a tip. Adolf Eichmann lived in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement. Wiesenthal contacted Israeli authorities. Argentine officials. Argentina ignored the information. Israel, still establishing its intelligence capabilities, couldn't immediately act. The lead went cold. But Wiesenthal never stopped searching, never stopped compiling evidence, documenting Eichmann's role organizing deportations, his specific responsibility for the logistics of mass murder, coordinating with railway schedules, ensuring sufficient cattle cars, calculating capacities of killing centers. This evidence would prove crucial when action finally became possible. The Mossad Israeli intelligence began actively hunting Nazi war criminals in the mid-1950s, driven by survivors within its ranks who viewed prosecution as moral imperative. Their methods differed from Wiesenthal's patient documentation. They operated as intelligence service, surveillance, infiltration, extraction. When opportunities arose, they acted decisively, sometimes extra-legally. The hunt for Adolf Eichmann became their most famous operation. In 1957, German prosecutor Fritz Bauer received information that Eichmann's son Klaus lived in Buenos Aires and had contact with his father. Bauer himself was Jewish. A Holocaust survivor, he understood that German authorities might leak the information former Nazis in the judicial system still protecting colleagues. So he contacted Israeli intelligence secretly, rather than official German channels. The Mossad dispatched agents to Buenos Aires in 1959 to confirm Eichmann's identity and plan extraction. The surveillance operation lasted months. Imagine the patience required. Agents rented a house near Eichmann's modest home in the suburban area of San Fernando, photographed him commuting from work, confirming his routine, the bus he took, the time he arrived home each evening, whether anyone accompanied him. They confirmed his identity through careful observation, his manner of walking, his approximate age, comparisons with old photographs. By May 1960, they had sufficient confirmation and a plan. May 11th, 1960, 7:30 in the evening. Eichmann walked toward his home after getting off the bus. A car pulled up. Men jumped out, grabbed him, forced him into the vehicle. Within seconds, the car vanished. Eichmann found himself at a safe house, held by Israeli agents who confirmed his identity through interrogation. For 9 days they kept him hidden while preparing extraction. On May 21st, they drugged him, dressed him as an El Al flight crew member, walked him through Argentine customs onto an Israeli airliner. Picture that moment. The architect of genocide, drugged and disguised, walking past Argentine officials who had no idea they were watching history unfold. The plane departed Buenos Aires, carrying him toward trial in Jerusalem. Argentina protested this violation of sovereignty. The UN Security Council condemned Israel's actions, but Israel had Eichmann, and within a year, he stood trial in Jerusalem, the first major prosecution of a Holocaust perpetrator in Israel. The trial lasted from April to December 1961, exposed details of the final solution to international audiences. Survivors testified about deportations, selections, gas chambers. Evidence documented Eichmann's central coordination role. In December, judges convicted him of crimes against humanity. In June 1962, Israel executed him by hanging, the only death sentence ever carried out by the State of Israel. His body was cremated, ashes scattered in international waters beyond Israel's territorial boundaries, ensuring no grave could become a shrine, even in death denied a place on earth. The Eichmann capture energized other Nazi hunting efforts. Prosecutors in Germany, embarrassed by Israel's success, intensified investigations. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials began in December 1963. 22 defendants, guards, administrators, doctors from Auschwitz in proceedings lasting until August 1965. Approximately 360 witnesses testified, many survivors traveling from across the world to describe what they'd endured. The trials received international media coverage, forcing Germans to confront detailed testimony about the Holocaust's mechanics. Courts convicted 17 defendants. Sentences ranged from life imprisonment to acquittals that outraged survivors. But Joseph Mengele remained free. Despite intensive searching reward money offered, investigations by West German prosecutors, Mossad operations in South America, he evaded capture for 34 years, moving between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Changing identities. Living with German expatriate families who sheltered him. In Paraguay, he briefly lived openly under his real name, protected by Stroessner's government. When pressure mounted, he fled to Brazil, adopting the identity Wolfgang Gerhard, living on a farm near São Paulo, isolated, paranoid, dependent on a small circle of German families who knew his real identity and protected him anyway. In February 1979, while swimming at a beach near Bertioga, Brazil, he suffered a stroke and drowned. Brazilian authorities buried him as Wolfgang Gerhard. His true identity remained unconfirmed until 1985, when German and Brazilian investigators exhumed the remains. Forensic examination comparing skulls to old photographs, analyzing bone structure confirmed the body was Josef Mengele. DNA testing in 1992 provided final proof. The angel of death had died peacefully, never facing trial, never convicted, escaping earthly justice entirely. And one must wonder what his final thoughts were, whether he felt remorse, whether he understood what he'd done, whether he died believing he'd won, having evaded justice for 3.5 decades, we'll never know. The questions died with him. Klaus Barbie's capture took 32 years. After escaping to Bolivia under American protection in 1951, he lived openly in La Paz as businessman Klaus Altmann, worked for the Bolivian military, advised on interrogation techniques, allegedly participated in tracking down Che Guevara in 1967. Beate and Serge Klarsfeld, French Nazi hunters, tracked him through the 1970s, gradually building international pressure. When Bolivia transitioned to democracy in 1983, new government officials proved more cooperative. France formally requested extradition. February 1983, Bolivian police arrested Barbie, expelled him to French custody. His trial in Lyon, May to July 1987, marked the first time France prosecuted crimes against humanity with no statute of limitations. Courts convicted him. Judges sentenced him to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991, age 77. 3 successful captures. Eichmann, Barbie, and through trials, hundreds more. But against how many perpetrators? The successes, remarkable as they were, represented tiny fractions of the total. Nuremberg tried 24 major leaders. Subsequent proceedings prosecuted 185 defendants. German courts initiated approximately 8,000 prosecutions between 1945 and 2010, against a pool of perhaps 1 million participants in Brand, Nazi crimes. Most perpetrators simply resumed normal lives. Camp guards became shopkeepers. Police officers who'd conducted roundups returned to law enforcement. Bureaucrats who'd processed deportation orders continued civil service careers. Thousands lived openly under real names, knowing that overwhelmed prosecutors couldn't pursue everyone. That witness memories faded. That documentary evidence had burned. That protecting governments valued stability over justice. Yet the hunters continued. Wiesenthal maintained his Vienna office until retirement in 2003. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles continued compiling most wanted lists. Germany's central office for the investigation of Nazi crimes in Ludwigsburg kept investigating. Prosecutors pursued cases even when defendants reached their 90s. Symbolic justice, perhaps, but maintaining principle that participation in genocide carried permanent criminal liability. In 2011, German courts convicted John Demjanjuk, age 91, for assisting murder of 27,900 people at Sobibor extermination camp. In 2015, Oskar Groening, age 94, bookkeeper at Auschwitz. In 2022, Irmgard Furchner, age 96, secretary at Stutthof camp. These late prosecutions sparked debate. Does justice mean anything when delivered 7 decades late, against elderly defendants who may lack full mental capacity? For symbolic sentences, they might not live to complete. Survivors remained divided. Some found closure in conviction regardless of timing. Others felt bitterness that perpetrators had lived full lives while their families died in childhood. But prosecutors maintained that certain crimes permit no statute of limitations. That society must affirm through conviction that genocide places perpetrators permanently beyond human community. The hunters continued their work, driven not by expectation of comprehensive justice. That possibility died decades earlier, but by moral imperative. That some crimes must never be forgotten, never forgiven, and in their persistence lies something profound about human nature, about the capacity for dedication to principle even when practical success seems impossible, about refusing to accept that evil can simply wait out justice, about maintaining moral witness across generations. The hunters remind us that accountability matters, even symbolic, even incomplete, even arriving so late that perpetrators are ancient and frail. Because the alternative, accepting that genocide can go unpunished if one merely survives long enough, is unacceptable. The hunt continues still. Though now hunting ghosts more than people, hunting answers more than perpetrators, hunting truth in the fragments of evidence that remain. Despite decades of investigation, fundamental questions about Nazi war criminals' escapes remain unanswered, not because evidence hasn't been examined, it has, exhaustively, but because evidence was deliberately destroyed, because witnesses died, because institutions concealed their complicity. The gaps in historical understanding aren't puzzles awaiting solution. They're permanent voids where truth was systematically erased. Consider Martin Bormann's fate. As Hitler's personal secretary and head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Bormann wielded enormous power in the Reich's final years, controlling access to Hitler, managing party finances. On May 1, 1945, as Soviet forces closed on the Führerbunker, he attempted escape through Berlin's ruins. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him that night, but accounts diverged afterward. Some claimed he committed suicide near Lehrte station. Others reported seeing him heading west. Rumors immediately spread that he'd escaped to South America, supposedly carrying millions in party funds, living quietly in Argentina or Paraguay. In 1972, construction workers in Berlin discovered human remains near where Bormann supposedly died. Forensic examination suggested the body matched Bormann's description. Age, dental work, skeletal structure. German authorities declared him officially dead in 1973. Yet doubts persisted for decades. The skull showed signs suggesting cyanide poisoning, consistent with suicide, but some questioned whether the remains were genuine or planted. In 1998, DNA testing compared the remains to samples from Bormann's living relatives. Results matched conclusively. Bormann had died in Berlin in May 1945. But questions remain. If Bormann died attempting escape, what happened to the millions he supposedly controlled? Nazi Party finances included enormous looted wealth, gold, currency, art, transferred to secret accounts in Switzerland, Spain, Argentina. Some investigators believe Bormann moved assets before Hitler's death, creating hidden accounts accessible by survivors. Others suggest subordinates absconded with funds in the chaos of collapse. No comprehensive accounting was ever achieved. Swiss banks, operating under strict secrecy laws, never fully disclosed accounts from the Nazi era until international pressure in the 1990s forced partial transparency. Even then, many dormant accounts remained unidentified. The money vanished as thoroughly as many perpetrators. Conspiracy theories about Hitler's own survival persisted for decades. Despite overwhelming evidence of his suicide in the Führerbunker on April 30, 1945, Soviet forces found burned remains in the Reich Chancellery Garden on May 4, identifying them through dental records as Hitler and Eva Braun. Yet Stalin deliberately spread uncertainty, telling Allied leaders that Hitler might have escaped, perhaps to feed paranoia, perhaps to conceal that the Soviet Union held the remains. For years, Moscow neither confirmed nor denied having Hitler's body. This official ambiguity fueled speculation. That Hitler fled to Argentina, that submarines carried him to Antarctica, that he lived secretly in various locations. Investigators repeatedly examined these theories and found them groundless. Multiple witnesses confirmed Hitler's presence in the bunker through April 30th, his suicide by gunshot, the burning of his body to prevent desecration like Mussolini had suffered. The dental records matched definitively. In 2009, Russia permitted independent examination of skull fragments and jawbone retained in Moscow archives. DNA testing confirmed the remains as Hitler's. Yet conspiracy theories persist online, demonstrating how absence of immediate transparency creates space for alternative narratives that resist factual correction. How mystery, once established, maintains itself despite evidence. The human mind, it seems, sometimes prefers dramatic uncertainty to mundane truth. More troubling than sensational mysteries are thousands of ordinary disappearances. The vast majority of perpetrators, camp guards, police officers, bureaucrats, train engineers, ghetto administrators, simply resumed civilian lives without prosecution. They changed nothing, often continued living in the same towns under real names, but overwhelmed judicial systems never reached them. Historian Raoul Hilberg estimated that approximately 100,000 people directly participated in killing operations, with hundreds of thousands more in supporting roles. German prosecutors initiated about 8,000 cases over 7 decades. The mathematics reveal the problem. Comprehensive prosecution was never possible, could never be possible. The crime was too large, the perpetrators too numerous, the evidence too dispersed. Documentation gaps ensure we'll never know complete truth. The Nazis systematically destroyed records as Allied forces advanced. Camp commandants burned administrative files before evacuating. SS headquarters shredded personnel records. Local police departments destroyed evidence of deportation involvement. The Einsatzgruppen kept detailed killing reports early in the war but destroyed many records later. Concentration camp prisoner registration books survived selectively. Auschwitz kept extensive records of registered prisoners, but people sent immediately to gas chambers received no registration, leaving no documentary trace. Mass graves across Eastern Europe contain thousands whose identities remain unknown, because records were destroyed, because families were entirely eliminated, because no one survived to remember names. The Catholic Church never fully disclosed its role in the ratlines. While individual clergy members' involvement became documented, Bishop Hudal's assistants, Father Draganovich's operations institutional records remained closed. The Vatican opened some archives in 2020, allowing historians access to Pope Pius XII's papers from the war years. But files related to post-war refugee assistance remain classified. How many Red Cross travel documents did Vatican offices facilitate? Which church officials knew they were assisting war criminals rather than genuine refugees? Did the Vatican hierarchy approve these operations, or did individual clergy act independently? The complete truth remains concealed within archives that may never open fully, and one must ask whether this serves institutional protection or genuine privacy concerns, whether documents contain information too embarrassing to release, or whether, after 8 decades, the Church simply prefers not to confront its role. American and British intelligence agencies similarly classified files for decades. Operation Paperclip records remained secret until the 1980s, when researchers obtained declassified documents showing how extensively files had been sanitized, how Nazi backgrounds had been deliberately obscured. CIA records on Klaus Barbie and other recruited agents stayed classified until the 1990s. The full extent of Western intelligence recruitment of former Nazis emerged only through persistent Freedom of Information Act requests and congressional inquiries. Even now, portions remain redacted. How many war criminals did Western intelligence employ? How extensively did agencies obstruct justice to protect assets? Did recruitment extend beyond publicly known cases? The complete accounting won't occur while agencies control access to their own historical records. Self-investigation rarely produces full disclosure. Organizations protect themselves, even perhaps especially from historical scrutiny. Swiss banks never provided full disclosure about Nazi-era accounts. For 5 decades after the war, Switzerland maintained strict banking secrecy, refusing to investigate dormant accounts, refusing to release information to heirs of Holocaust victims. International pressure in the 1990s, particularly from the United States, threatening sanctions finally forced Switzerland to permit independent investigation. The Bergier Commission, working from 1996 to 2002, examined wartime financial relationships. They documented that Swiss banks accepted approximately 440 tons of gold from Nazi Germany, much looted from occupied territories, much stolen from Holocaust victims, gold fillings torn from murdered Jews, melted down, stamped with Reichsbank seals, presented as legitimate state assets. They found that thousands of dormant accounts belonged to Holocaust victims whose families couldn't access them. Banks demanded death certificates, impossible to obtain when entire families were murdered, or because account holders had never told family members about Swiss deposits. Banks eventually paid approximately $1.25 billion in settlement to Holocaust survivors and heirs. But questions remain about accounts never investigated, assets never disclosed, money that simply disappeared into the Swiss financial system and never emerged. The fate of thousands of specific individuals remains unknown. Johann Breyer, concentration camp guard, appeared in American immigration records in 1952, settled in Philadelphia. Lived openly until 2014 when German authorities finally requested extradition. He died before extradition proceedings completed. Age 89. Having lived 69 years in America undiscovered, how many others followed similar paths? Immigration records from the late 1940s show thousands of Germans and Eastern Europeans admitted to the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain. With minimal background screening, some were legitimate refugees, others falsified their histories. Without systematic investigation, which never occurred, Individual cases remain lost in bureaucratic records. Names in files, photographs on documents, people who walked through immigration, started new lives, and simply vanished into the populations of their adopted countries. Lower-level perpetrators vanished most successfully. Historians documented the names and crimes of senior SS officers, camp commandants, Einsatzgruppen unit leaders. But what about the thousands of ordinary guards? The police officers who conducted roundups? The railway workers who operated deportation trains? Most lived out normal lives, their participation known only to themselves and fellow perpetrators who kept silent. They're present in town records, employment histories, family photographs, ordinary citizens whose past remained hidden. Occasionally, survivors recognized former perpetrators and reported them to authorities, but most simply were never identified. Time itself destroyed evidence relentlessly. Witnesses died, survivors, bystanders, perpetrators themselves. Each death removed potential testimony. Memories faded. Elderly witnesses in the 1980s couldn't recall details clearly from 1944. Physical evidence degraded. Mass graves in Eastern European forests gradually disappeared as vegetation reclaimed the land. Buildings that served as killing centers were demolished. Documents stored improperly deteriorated. The passage of 8 decades turned what might have been investigated thoroughly in 1946 into mysteries unsolvable by 2025. And here we must confront something uncomfortable about the nature of historical truth. We imagine that with sufficient effort, sufficient research, sufficient determination, we can know what happened, can document every event, identify every perpetrator, account for every victim. But some truths are simply lost, not hidden, lost, destroyed deliberately or degraded naturally until no recovery is possible. The questions without answers aren't failures of investigation. They're inevitable consequences of time and human action. Of evidence systematically eliminated. Of witnesses who never spoke or died before speaking. Of systems designed to obscure rather than reveal. The unanswered questions haunt every examination of Nazi escapes, not because we lack pieces, but because fundamental information was deliberately destroyed, systematically concealed, or simply lost to time's passage. The mysteries aren't solvable puzzles. They're permanent gaps where truth once existed and now only absence remains. And in that absence, in those voids where answers should be, we find perhaps the most troubling truth of all. That comprehensive justice was never merely difficult, it was impossible, not because will was lacking, not because effort was insufficient, but because the crime was too vast, the perpetrators too numerous, the destruction of evidence too thorough, and time itself an ally of those who escaped. We know enough to understand what occurred, but never enough to account fully for who participated, who escaped, who helped them, and whether they ever felt remorse. Those questions died with them, and no amount of investigation can resurrect the dead or recover deliberately destroyed truth. The hunt continues for what remains findable, but hunters and historians alike now hunt knowing that comprehensive answers will never come, that some secrets followed their keepers to the grave, that some mysteries will haunt history forever. The failure to comprehensively prosecute Nazi war criminals didn't merely allow individuals to escape justice. It established a template, a pattern that perpetrators of future genocides would follow, creating recurring cycles of mass atrocity, followed by impunity that have marked the past 8 decades. And I want you to understand something crucial here. This isn't abstract history. This isn't merely about the past. The mechanisms that allowed Nazi escapes, delay tactics, sympathetic protectors, false identities, powerful states prioritizing stability over justice, these mechanisms reappear, again and again. In Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Syria, in Myanmar. The pattern repeats because impunity teaches. Each unpunished genocide instructs future perpetrators that escape is possible, that comprehensive accountability is unlikely, that time favors them. Cambodia demonstrated the pattern with horrifying clarity, Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime murdered approximately 1.7 million Cambodians, roughly 1/4 of the population, through execution, forced labor, starvation. Pol Pot and his leadership implemented systematic elimination of educated classes. Ethnic, Vietnamese and Chinese minorities, Buddhist monks, anyone suspected of opposition. When Vietnamese forces invaded in 1979, driving out the Khmer Rouge, perpetrators fled to Thai border regions. There they established camps, received support from China and tacit Western assistance. America and its allies opposed the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh and conducted guerrilla operations for 2 decades. 2 decades, living in camps, reorganizing, remaining armed, while the world knew what they'd done. The Khmer Rouge leadership lived freely in refugee camps and Thai territory throughout the 1980s and 90s. Pol Pot himself wasn't captured by international authorities. He remained with remaining Khmer Rouge forces until internal disputes led to his house arrest by his own movement in 1997. He died under guard in April 1998, never facing trial. Other senior leaders, Nuon Chea, Kyo Samphan, Ieng Sari, remained at large until the 2000s. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, established in 2006 with UN support, finally began prosecutions. But by then, decades had passed. Pol Pot had died. Many perpetrators had died of natural causes. The first conviction came in 2010. 31 years after the genocide ended, the pattern mirrored Nazi escapes precisely. Delay allowed time to erase accountability. Witnesses died, evidence degraded, international attention shifted, perpetrators aged into frailty, and time accomplished what legal systems couldn't: elimination through natural mortality. Rwanda's genocide in 1994 killed approximately 800,000 people, mostly Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Over 100 days from April to July, Hutu power extremists organized systematic slaughter using military forces, police, and civilian militias called Interahamwe. When Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front forces captured Kigali in July, ending the genocide, approximately 2 million Hutus fled to Zaire, Tanzania, and other neighboring countries. Among them were thousands of genocidaires, organizers, militia leaders, killers, who simply merged into refugee populations. UN refugee camps in eastern Zaire became havens for genocide perpetrators. Camps intended for innocent civilians housed Interahamwe militia, who reorganized, maintained weapons, conducted raids back into Rwanda. International humanitarian organizations faced an impossible dilemma. Providing aid to refugees meant feeding and sheltering genocidaires mixed among genuine victims. Some perpetrators became camp administrators, controlling aid distribution. Imagine that. The people who organized genocide controlling humanitarian assistance, using international aid to maintain their power structures, while the world watched, unable or unwilling to separate perpetrators from victims. France's Operation Turquoise, ostensibly humanitarian, created a safe zone in southwestern Rwanda that allowed genocidaires to escape across the border into Zaire. French military forces, which had armed and trained the Hutu government forces before the genocide, facilitated the escape of officials responsible for mass murder. Thousands of genocide perpetrators fled to Europe and North America, falsifying refugee applications, claiming to be genocide victims rather than perpetrators. Canada, Belgium, France, and other nations admitted Rwandans who concealed their participation in killing. Years later, survivors living in these countries would recognize perpetrators on city streets, the person who killed their family members living openly in Montreal or Brussels, going to work, shopping for groceries, walking past them on sidewalks, while authorities, when notified, struggled to build cases across continents, with evidence destroyed in Rwanda's chaos. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, established in November 1994, prosecuted 93 defendants over 20 years, against approximately 200,000 people who participated in the genocide. Rwanda's own Gacaca courts tried approximately 1.2 million cases. International justice addressed a tiny fraction. As with the Nazis, comprehensive prosecution proved impossible. The crime was too large, the perpetrators too numerous, the evidence too dispersed. The Yugoslav wars demonstrated the pattern again. Between 1992 and 1995, Bosnian Serb forces implemented ethnic cleansing, systematic killing, mass rape, deportation of Bosnian Muslims. The Srebrenica massacre in July 1995 murdered approximately 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys over several days. Ratko Mladic, commanding Bosnian Serb forces, and Radovan Karadzic, political leader, orchestrated the genocide. When NATO intervention ended the war in 1995, both went underground. They lived in Serbia for years, protected by sympathetic elements within Serbian security forces and nationalist communities. Mladic remained free for 16 years after the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia indicted him in 1995, living in Serbia. Protected by military and intelligence officers who provided safe houses, who warned him about capture attempts. Serbian authorities claimed they couldn't locate him despite international pressure. Only in May 2011 did Serbian security forces finally arrest him, following renewed EU pressure conditioning Serbian membership on cooperation with the tribunal. Karadzic hid for 13 years, living in Belgrade under an alias Dr. Dragan David Darbic, practicing alternative medicine, attending public conferences, walking openly in the city while wanted for genocide. Both received convictions eventually. Mladic in 2017, Karadzic in 2016, more than 2 decades after their crimes, by which time they were elderly, by which time many victims had died without seeing justice. Syria's civil war, beginning in 2011, produced massive atrocities. Chemical weapons attacks, systematic torture, starvation sieges, documented by international monitors, yet prosecution remains, largely impossible. President Bashar al-Assad remains in power, protected by Russian military intervention. Officers who commanded chemical attacks against civilians continue serving in the Syrian military. Some mid-level officials who defected to Europe face prosecution. Germany convicted former intelligence officer Ayad al-Gharib in 2021, but senior leadership remains beyond reach, protected by state power, by geopolitical interests that prioritize stability in the region over accountability for atrocities. Myanmar's military campaign against Rohingya Muslims in 2017 killed approximately 25,000 people, drove over 700,000 into Bangladesh as refugees. UN investigators documented systematic killings, mass rape, village burning. The International Court of Justice ordered Myanmar to prevent genocide in 2020, but Myanmar's military leadership faces no prosecution. They remain in power, having conducted a coup in February 2021. The pattern continues. Mass atrocity occurs. International community condemns it. Perpetrators remain protected by state power or sympathetic governments. Each instance of impunity teaches future perpetrators that they might escape accountability. That delay works in their favor, that powerful protectors can shield them, that false identities enable disappearance, that time erodes evidence and witness memory, that international attention eventually shifts. The mechanisms that allowed Nazi war criminals to escape justice, ratlines, false papers, protection by churches or governments, recruitment by intelligence agencies reappear in modified forms across 8 decades of subsequent atrocities. Modern developments create new challenges. Digital communications allow perpetrators to coordinate remotely, to destroy evidence systematically. Satellite imagery and social media documentation provide unprecedented evidence of atrocities, but also teach perpetrators to avoid leaving traces. International criminal law has advanced. The International Criminal Court exists. No statute of limitations applies to genocide. Yet powerful nations refuse to participate. The United States, Russia, China haven't joined the ICC, limiting enforcement, allowing them to protect allies from prosecution. Technology also aids accountability. DNA analysis identifies remains from mass graves. Digital forensics recovers destroyed files. Cell phone records track perpetrators' movements. Social media posts provide evidence of participation in atrocities. These tools would have transformed Nazi prosecutions if they'd existed in 1945. Applied to contemporary atrocities, they may increase successful prosecutions. But they can't overcome fundamental problems. Powerful states still protect perpetrators. Witness intimidation continues, and comprehensive prosecution of mass atrocities remains logistically impossible when thousands participated. The pattern established by Nazi impunity continues, not because we haven't learned lessons, but because the incentives that enabled it remain. States prioritizing security over justice, institutions protecting themselves, communities choosing silence over confronting difficult truths. Each repetition affirms that comprehensive accountability after genocide remains an unrealized ideal, not a guaranteed outcome. We've built international institutions, established legal frameworks, developed technologies for documentation. Yet still, perpetrators escape. Still, justice arrives late or not at all. Still, survivors watch as those who destroyed their families live free. And we must ask ourselves difficult questions about whether humanity truly learns from history, about whether justice after mass atrocity is achievable, about whether the systems we've built are sufficient or merely performative gestures that satisfy our moral discomfort while changing little. The pattern repeats because changing patterns requires more than good intentions. It requires confronting powerful interests. It requires prioritizing accountability over stability. It requires resources and political will sustained across decades. It requires accepting that comprehensive justice might destabilize societies in the short term, but serves essential principles in the long term. Until we make those commitments, truly make them, not merely declare them, the pattern will continue repeating. Atrocities will occur. Perpetrators will escape, time will erode accountability, and future generations will ask, as we ask about Nazi escapes, how this was allowed to happen. How we learned nothing from history that we swore never to forget. In 2022, German prosecutors convicted Irmgard Furchner, age 96, for complicity in murder of over 10,000 people at Stutthof concentration camp. Between 1943 and 1945, she had worked as secretary to the camp commandant, typing deportation orders, typing correspondence about prisoner killings, sitting at a desk, performing administrative tasks, while thousands died. The trial sparked debate. Why prosecute someone in their 90s for crimes committed 8 decades earlier? Who sits frail in a courtroom, barely resembling the young woman who typed those orders? Survivors remained divided. Some found closure in conviction, formal acknowledgement that what happened to them was criminal, that perpetrators bear responsibility regardless of time passage. Others felt bitterness that Furchner lived 77 years of freedom while her victims died in childhood. One survivor testified that seeing her convicted mattered more than the sentence, because it affirmed that society remembered, that crimes don't become acceptable merely because decades pass. These late prosecutions represent symbolic justice, affirmation of principles rather than practical punishment. Germany's Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Ludwigsburg continues investigating, though remaining living perpetrators are centenarians. The Simon Wiesenthal Center maintains its most wanted Nazi war criminals list, updated as suspects die. As of 2025, only a handful of names remain, all born in the 1920s, all in their late 90s if still alive. Time has accomplished what legal systems didn't, eliminating perpetrators through natural mortality. But the questions these efforts address transcend individual cases. Continuing prosecution, 8 decades later, sends a message. Certain crimes place perpetrators permanently outside human community. Participation in genocide isn't forgiven by time's passage. This principle matters not for past atrocities. Nazi perpetrators are nearly all dead, but for future ones. Prosecutors pursuing centenarian defendants are simultaneously warning potential perpetrators that genocide carries permanent criminal liability, that they cannot simply wait out international attention, that no matter how long they hide, how old they become, accountability remains possible. Recent document releases continue revealing how extensively institutions protected war criminals. In 2018, Germany declassified intelligence files, showing that West German Foreign Intelligence Service employed at least dozens of former Gestapo officers in the 1950s and 60s, concealing their backgrounds, shielding them from prosecution. In 2019, Chile released files documenting Colonia Dignidad, a German expatriate community led by Paul Schaefer, former Nazi, that became a torture center cooperating with Pinochet's dictatorship. These revelations, arriving 75 years after the war, demonstrate how much remains unknown. The International Tracing Service archives in Bad Arolsen, Germany, contain approximately 30 million documents about Nazi persecution and displaced persons. Digitization began in 2008, making records accessible online. Researchers continue discovering information that answers specific questions, confirming deaths, identifying perpetrators, documenting escapes. But gaps remain permanent. No document survives listing all Einsatzgruppen members. No complete roll exists of camp guards at smaller facilities. Millions of individual stories remain unknowable because evidence never existed or was destroyed. The questions about Nazi war criminals' escapes matter to contemporary issues. The networks that sheltered them, corrupt officials, false documentation systems, sympathetic institutions mirror modern mechanisms, protecting human traffickers, war criminals, authoritarian figures. Understanding how fugitives evaded justice teaches what barriers must exist to prevent future impunity. Switzerland's banking secrecy enabled Nazis to hide looted wealth. Modern transparency requirements attempt to prevent similar concealment. Interpol's Red Notice system emerged partly from failures to track fugitives across borders during the post-war period. International criminal law concepts like crimes against humanity and universal jurisdiction developed specifically because Nazi prosecutions revealed gaps in existing legal frameworks. Younger generations question whether events 8 decades old remain relevant. The last Holocaust survivors die. Soon only recorded testimony and written accounts will remain. But the questions these events raised persist. How do societies prevent mass atrocity? How do communities confront complicity in crimes? How do legal systems balance justice against competing priorities? These aren't merely historical questions. They're contemporary challenges facing nations dealing with recent genocides, authoritarian violence, systematic human rights violations. The escape of thousands of Nazi war criminals represents one of history's greatest justice failures. Of approximately 1 million people who participated in Nazi crimes, from senior leaders to ordinary guards, only a tiny fraction faced prosecution. Most simply resumed normal lives, their participation unknown or deliberately ignored. This failure occurred not through oversight, but through deliberate choices. Allied priorities shifting to Cold War concerns. Intelligence agencies valuing ex-Nazis as assets. Governments prioritizing stability over accountability. Institutions protecting complicit members. The consequences shaped subsequent history. Perpetrators of later genocides learned that comprehensive punishment was unlikely, that powerful protectors might shield them. That time favored escape over accountability. The mechanisms that enabled Nazi escapes, false documentation, sympathetic networks, state protection reappeared in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and beyond. Each instance of impunity reinforced the pattern. Yet efforts continue. International criminal law evolved specifically to address gaps Nazi prosecutions revealed. The International Criminal Court exists to ensure perpetrators can't escape jurisdiction by fleeing to sympathetic nations. Modern forensic science provides tools that might have prevented escapes if available in 1945. Civil society organizations maintain pressure on governments to declassify files and pursue remaining cases. The questions remain unanswered not because we've stopped asking, but because complete answers are impossible. Too many documents burned. Too many witnesses died. Too many institutions concealed their complicity. We'll never know everyone who escaped, everywhere they fled, everyone who helped them. The gaps in understanding are permanent. Voids where truth once existed and now only speculation remains. But the questions themselves serve a purpose. They keep memory active, maintain moral vigilance, remind us that justice delayed remains better than justice abandoned. The pursuit continues not because it will succeed comprehensively, but because the alternative, accepting that genocide can go unpunished, is unacceptable. The hunters may never catch every perpetrator, never answer every question, never recover every truth. But they continue hunting, and in that persistence lies affirmation that some crimes transcend time, that accountability matters even when incomplete, that the questions themselves, unanswered though they may be, prevent history from being forgotten or forgiven. When you lie awake at night, perhaps these questions will drift through your consciousness, not keeping you alert with anxiety, but settling like gentle weight, reminding you of what humanity is capable of, both terrible and noble, the capacity for organized evil, but also the capacity for persistent pursuit of justice across generations. The Nazi war criminals who escaped justice are nearly all gone now, dead of old age, having lived lives their victims never could, having seen grandchildren their victims never had, having experienced decades of freedom purchased by distance, by false names, by powerful protectors, by bureaucratic chaos, by institutional complicity. But they didn't escape history's judgment. We know what they did. We know how they escaped. We know who helped them. And we know, now, that such escapes can never be allowed again. That the systems enabling impunity must be dismantled. That accountability must be pursued regardless of difficulty. The questions echo across 8 decades, unanswered but not forgotten, incomplete but still instructive, haunting but ultimately purposeful. They echo as warning, as testament, as memorial to those who died and those who spent their lives hunting justice. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep tonight, you'll carry with you not anxiety about these dark chapters of history, but something else: appreciation for those who refuse to forget. Gratitude for hunters who never quit despite impossible odds. Resolve that future generations won't face these same unanswered questions because we finally learned, finally committed, finally built systems that prioritize accountability over expediency. The story of how thousands of Nazi war criminals escaped justice is also the story of why justice matters. Why persistence matters, why questions, even unanswered, serve essential purposes in maintaining humanity's moral compass. The hunt continues, the questions echo, the commitment endures, and in that endurance lies perhaps our best defense against history repeating, our clearest affirmation that some truths, however incomplete, must never be abandoned, that some pursuits, however difficult, must never end.